in our deployment of a virtual machine, let's go ahead and put a plan in place. Let's go ahead and use a Linux-based guest operating system, and let's go ahead and add the VM as a virtual machine running on ESXi2. And let's think about if we had a physical computer and we wanted to get Linux running on it, what would we need? Well, it's very likely we're going to have some installation media, some type of an ISO or a DVD drive that we can put in that drive and then boot the Linux box up. It reads off that DVD and then the installation can begin. Also, on a real Linux device, we'd have, for example, some type of disk storage, like a hard disk or disks. We'd have some memory. We'd have a network adapter if we wanted to communicate on the network. And we'd also have at least a processor or two in that computer. And then other things as well, like, for example, USB ports and keyboards and everything else. So in our virtual environment, if we create a new virtual machine and we give it a logical DVD drive as part of its configuration, and then regarding that DVD drive, we point to an actual ISO image that, for example, let's say ESXi2 has a folder for ISO images that we place there, and let's say we have an image for the Linux operating system ISO, or some flavor of Linux. Then the virtual machine boots up. It reads off of this ISO that's on the data store from ESXi2. From a guest operating system, it just thinks it's a DVD drive, and then we can do the install to the disk. Now, as we work with a virtual disk for this virtual machine, anytime the virtual machine is doing reads or writes to its virtual disk, those are also being handled by the ESXi host, and the ESXi host is using a data store again. In our case, it's going to be a local data store on ESXi2 to service that virtual machine. So when the Linux machine actually does a write request to its hard drive, that write is actually being put on the data store. And conversely, if the Linux device does a read from its hard disk, that's being pulled from the data store by the ESXi host and then fed back to the virtual machine. So in a VMware environment, the configuration regarding the virtual machine is kept as a file. The hard disk or disks are kept as files. And so if we had a new computer called Linux 1 that we created as a virtual machine, on the data store that we select on the ESXi host, it would create a folder called Linux-1, and then there would be a collection of files representing the configuration, the hard drive or drives, and other elements regarding that virtual machine, all kept in files on the data store. Another interesting thing happens when we use guest operating systems and we put them on virtual machines. Sometimes the device drivers are not optimized to work in a virtualized environment. So to adapt a virtual machine's device drivers and other tools, VMware has a set of tools called VMware Tools. And with VMware Tools, we can go ahead and install those VMware tools on the guest operating system. And that way it can update device drivers, for example, for display and network. And it also has some tools that work with the operating system that make it easier and more effective and efficient for an ESXi host to manage the resources that the VM is requesting and using. And depending on the operating system, additional counters that also would be available to be seen in the virtual machine, and also providing additional insight to the ESXi host regarding that virtual machine. So most of the time, we are going to want to implement the VMware tools on our guest operating systems so we can have the benefits that those tools bring to the table. So I've got an ISO image that I have copied over to the data store locally on ESXi2. So for our demonstration, let's go ahead and go to our Windows machine. We'll connect to the vCenter server using the vSphere web client, and we'll indicate that we want to create a new virtual machine. It'll ask us some questions about that virtual machine, which we'll answer. And then once it's deployed and running, we'll go ahead and add the VMware tools to it and verify that it all works. So we're going to start here on our Windows Management Computer, DCNUG, and we'll just double click on the icon. There's a shortcut for the vSphere web client over here on the left to launch the vSphere web client. We'll put our cursor in the username field, and I'm going to use the lab tools to pump in the administrator at vsphere.local, and we'll supply the password as well. And then we'll click log in. I'm going to bring the browser window full screen by hitting F11, and that does not seem to be taking it. If the F11 key doesn't work for some reason for maximizing going full screen with the browser window, we can click on the little icon over here for customizing control for Google Chrome, and then we can click on this icon here, which represents full screen. And then to bring it back, we can hit F11 to exit out of full screen. So what we want to do is we want to create a new virtual machine. So there's several ways of going about this. Currently, we're on the little tab here for hosts and clusters. And from here, we could right click on the LV data center. And from the drop down, there's an option for new virtual machine. If we hover over that, there's another menu. And from that, we're going to select new virtual machine. This brings up a wizard. So it's going to walk us through these steps over here on the left. So we'll click on Next to continue. It's asking us what do we want to call it. Let's call this Linux-1. It's also asking us where do we want to place it. So we're going to place it in the Las Vegas data center. So with that selected, we'll click on Next. Next, it says, hey, you got to run this on a compute resource, an ESXi host that can support this virtual machine. You have 3 choices in this data center. Which one do you want to use? So we'll go ahead and select ESXi2 based on our plan. And with ESXi2 selected, we'll click on Next. Next, we're going to choose the storage. Now, from an ESXi2 perspective, it only has one data store, which we renamed earlier to ESXi-2_data store. And it's got about 70 gigabytes free. So on this data store, when we create this virtual machine, the ESXi host is going to store everything about that virtual machine, its configuration files, its hard disk files, and everything else in that folder regarding that virtual machine. So with ESXi2 data store selected, we'll click on Next. Next, it's asking about compatibility. The compatibility question is great because if we have in our vSphere environment an older version of ESXi, and this virtual machine might need at some point to run on that older version of ESXi, we want it to be compatible. So in our lab environment, everything is 6.5, so we don't need to worry about older ESXi hosts in this lab environment. So we're going to go ahead and click on ESXi 6.5 and later, and click on Next. Next, it's asking us about which guest OS do we intend to run on this new virtual machine that we're creating. And the reason that it's asking us is because there's a lot of defaults. For example, how many CPUs, how big of a hard drive, and so forth, based on what we intend to put on that virtual machine. So this is not VMware saying, hey, we'll install an operating system for you. This is simply VMware trying to pre-guess some appropriate defaults regarding the virtual machine hardware based on the operating system that we choose. So from the guest OS family, let's go ahead and select Linux. And then from the drop-down, VMware Photon. Photon is the Linux flavor that's being used on the vCenter server appliance. So from the drop-down, let's go ahead and see if they have some flavor of Ubuntu 32-bit. So I think I passed it. There we go. So I'm going to select Ubuntu 32-bit. If you get it wrong, it might just make the VM maybe a little more beefy than it should be, or maybe not as beefy as it should be. And again, this is just a kind of a guideline for some of the basics of the virtual machine regarding hardware and configuration, which we can also change if we want to. So with the Ubuntu Linux 32-bit selected, we'll click on Next. And now regarding customizing that hardware, it's given us a bunch of defaults which we can change if we want to. So with the virtual hardware selection selected up here, if we wanted to change the number of CPUs, we could simply go in and look at the details of that and use the little arrow on the left-hand side, and then we could change the number of CPUs that we're going to give this virtual machine. Now, one thing we can't do is if we have, for example, an ESXi host that has 1 core, 1 processor, you can't give a virtual machine that's running on this ESXi host 4 processors because the ESXi host behind the scenes wouldn't be able to support it. So I'm going to go ahead and accept some of these recommendations, except I think I'm going to tweak the hard disk. So we'll go ahead and click on the arrow next to New Hard Disk. And what I think I would like to do is I think I'd like to change the disk provisioning right here. And instead of saying thick provisioned lazy zeroed, which effectively says if it's a 16 gig drive, take up all that space right now on the data store, all 16 gig. That's thick provisioning. So from the drop down, I'm going to go ahead and specify thin provisioning. And that way, if we say it's 16 gigs, but literally we're only using 1 gig, it'll only tie up 1 gig of space on the data store. So I don't think we're going to need anywhere near 16 gigs for this virtual machine, but because it's thin provisioned, it won't really matter because we're not taking up the full 16 gigs right off the bat. So I'll go ahead and let's collapse the new hard disk by using that little arrow to the left. So it has a network adapter. It's going to be connected to a network called VM network. We'll talk more about that in a networking nugget. And regarding a new CD/DVD drive, let's go ahead and from the drop down here, let's specify that we want to use a data store ISO file, at which point it gives us an opportunity to browse the data store. So here's the ESXi2 data store, courtesy of ESXi2. So we'll expand that. Then we'll click on ISO images. And what I did prior to this nugget is I simply used a copy function, and I copied from my computer an ISO image to this folder on that data store. So I've got one for darn small Linux, and I've got one for Ubuntu or Xubuntu. So let's select the Xubuntu image, and with it highlighted, we'll go ahead and click on OK. And if we wanted to see the details for that, we could expand the CD-ROM drive. So there it's showing us the ISO that is going to be virtually placed in its virtual drive. We also want to do a connected power on so that when we power on this virtual machine, it'll see that DVD drive with its inserted or logically inserted ISO image. So if we collapse this, over here on the right of this drive, we have a little checkbox for connect, and the check is in it based on our configuration we just did. We could also play with that little checkbox right here as well. So these parts that are in yellow are reflecting changes that we made from the defaults that were provided us regarding this virtual machine. So with those in place, we'll go ahead and click on Next. Then there's a summary, and we'll click on Finish. And right here under ESXi2, there we have our Linux One virtual machine. If we click on that, which I just did, now all of these tabs up here on top, if we click on them, are going to be related to this object, the Linux One virtual machine. Also, while I'm here, I'm going to go ahead and remove the Getting Started tab off of all these pages. And to do that, we simply go to Help. From the drop-down, simply click on Hide All Getting Started pages, and those tabs go away. If we want to bring that back, just go back to Help, and select Show All Getting Started pages, and that'll bring them back. So regarding this virtual machine that we currently have selected over here on the left, we have information here on the summary page regarding that virtual machine. We can move these around and expand them. For example, if we want to expand the VM hardware, we just click on the little arrow next to VM hardware. It's going to show us the information about that virtual machine. Currently it's powered off. And if we want to move these around, we can drag and drop these around based on our preference of what we want to see and where we want to see them. So let's power on this virtual machine. There's multiple ways that we could do it. We could right click on the virtual machine right here and then hover over power and then select power on, or because this Linux virtual machine is selected, we could go ahead and use this icon up here to power on the virtual machine. So let's go ahead and power it on. And now the question is, how do we go to the console of that virtual machine? And this is really, really fun. All we're going to do is going to click on this icon right here for the virtual machine, and that'll take us to it. Or we could right click on the virtual machine and select Open Console. Now, the first time we do an Open Console, it's going to ask us what we want the default console to be. Do you want to see it in a web console, or do you want to use the VMware Remote Console as a separate application to reach out and get a console to that virtual machine? So I'm going to go ahead and select Web Console and click on Continue. And it took us to that web console. Also, because my browser is in full screen mode, I'm going to go ahead and press F11 so we can see what's happening. What it did for us, it opened up a new tab, and this is where I'm looking at this new virtual machine console. So if we go back to here, to the vSphere web client, we can go back to our management interface. And if we ever want to change how we want to connect, which console we want to use, we can click on the gear right here for the virtual machine. And then we can select Change Default Console. And also from here, we can select to launch Remote Console or launch Web Console. And because the Remote Console is a separate application, there's also an option right here to install it on this local computer, on our management computer. So if we want to do the install, which we do, let's go ahead and click on the Linux tab, and we'll do the install. So let's click on Install Xubuntu. I'm going to leave these checkboxes unchecked and just click on Continue. It's asking me if I want to erase the disk, the virtual disk, on this virtual machine and install Xubuntu. So let's click on Install Now, and then we'll click Continue to continue. I'm going to select the time zone that I happen to be in, which is Pacific time. We'll click on Continue. Regarding the keyboard layout, I'm going to choose English and click on Continue. And for a username, let's go ahead and put in Bob, and let's tab down, and for our password, let's put in our lab password. And then I'm also going to click on Login automatically, so it automatically logs in as Bob every single time. So we'll click on Continue. And ta-da! The installation is done, and we'll click on Restart now to reboot this virtual machine. There's a note here at the bottom that says, please remove the installation medium, then press Enter. So I'm going to go ahead and press Enter. We could, if we wanted to, go back to the virtual machine configuration, remove the check from the checkbox regarding that the CD-ROM is connected. But the intention, either way, is for this virtual machine to boot from its hard drive, its logical hard drive. And so from a programming perspective, if the physical media was no longer there, the ISO wasn't there, it would be impossible to boot from it. And some of that would depend on the settings that are in the BIOS regarding what to check first. Hard disk first, then DVD, etc. And here's our virtual machine. So now we can work with this computer just like any other computer. So if we click on the little icon in the top left-hand corner and click on Settings and then click on Desktop, We can customize our desktop. For example, let's go ahead and choose a different graphic. I'm going to go ahead and choose this one that looks like the Paramount Pictures logo and click on Close. And now next, let's install VMware tools on this virtual machine. Now look at the desktop. We've got a floppy disk, trash, file system, and home. And if we go back to the vSphere web client, and with our virtual machine selected, we have a big warning here saying VMware tools is not installed on this virtual machine. And if we wanted to solve that problem, we could go ahead and click on this link here to install VMware tools. What it's going to do in a Linux environment is simply going to mount the VMware tools DVD logically on the virtual machine. So if we click on Install VMware Tools, and then we click on Mount, it's going to mount that DVD or that CD on the virtual machine. So now if we go back to the virtual machine and look at the desktop right here, we've got an icon for a drive. So there's our VMware Tools. And then what we do is we could extract the VMware Tools. So here we have a tar file. If we right click on it, and from the drop down select Extract to, and we could just put it right on the desktop if we wanted to. So that's where I'm going to put it. I'll go ahead and double click on Desktop. And then I can't see the OK button down here. So to solve that, I'm going to maximize this window and click on the little plus symbol over here. So now I can see the extract button. So we'll click on the extract button in the bottom right hand corner, and that'll extract those files for us. So now we have an additional folder right here, right on the desktop. So to actually run the install in a Linux environment, what we would do is go to the command line. So I'm going to click on the mouse one more time, top left hand corner, click on Terminal Emulator. That's pretty small, so I'm going to go ahead and click on Edit and Preferences, and I'm going to make the font a little bit bigger. So on the Appearance tab, I'll go ahead and use the drop down for font, and let's go ahead and set it for 12 point, and click on OK. And then close, and that's a little bit better. So here if we do an ls, and we need to go to our desktop, so we'll do a cd space capital D ES and then tab it out to change to our desktop folder. And then from here we'll do an ls. There's our VMware Tools distribution folder, so we'll change directory to that. And then from here, if we do an ls, here we have the vmware-install.pl. So to install that, we're going to need some privileges. We're going to type in sudo space /, which means we're going to run this from the current folder, and then type in VMware, and then you can tab out the rest. And then if you press enter, it's going to walk you through the installation of VMware Tools. Or we could also use a -D, which means don't prompt me. And you can press enter. It wants the password for Bob, which is our lab password, which I'll supply. And that just kind of bit me. So the -D says go ahead and accept all the defaults. And one of those defaults was the question here, do you still want to proceed with this installation? In the brackets, there's a no. And because that's the default, it stopped the installation. It's also referring us to this document right here, which refers to the open VM tools that we can implement on Linux-based systems, which could be an option instead of doing it directly from the VMware tools. So whether you're using the open VM tools or using VMware's VMware tools, the idea is to get the additional drivers and support. So if we run this again, I'll hit the up arrow key. I'll hit the up arrow key. I'm going to take off the -D, and we'll simply manually go through the steps. Do you still want to proceed? We're going to type in yes, and then I'm going to go ahead and simply hit enter for all the other defaults, which I would have wanted to accept anyway. And it is done. Now what we want to do is we could reboot this virtual machine just to make sure that everything's in place. Now before we leave this terminal window, if we wanted to install the open VM tools, it's really easy to do. We'll do a sudo for the elevated privileges, and then run apt-get space install space and then open-vm-tools, just like that. We'll press enter. If we typed in Y here, it would go ahead and automatically install the open VM tools on this Linux-based machine, which would include some of the additional support that the official VMware tools would also give us. So I'm going to say no to this because we don't need a duplicate set, if you will, of VM-related tools. So let's go ahead and reboot this VM. We'll do a sudo space reboot and press enter, and that'll reboot it. And as it reboots, it's going to have all those tools installed and ready to go. And where applicable and available, updated drivers for things like the video and the network adapter and mouse drivers that allow the operating system and the resources it controls to operate even better in a virtualized environment. So now, if we go back to the vSphere web client, you'll notice we have this message, VMware Tools is not installed, and that's because we need to do the mighty refresh right here. So we'll click on the refresh to refresh the information. So regarding this virtual machine, we're focused on it here. We're on the summary tab, and it's showing us that we're currently running the VMware Tools version 10272. And since we're right here, if we wanted to go take a look at the actual file system on the data store that the ESXi host is using to support this virtual machine, it's really easy to do. There are several ways of getting to the data store. Because we're right here focused on Linux 1, the virtual machine, with it selected, if we simply click on the Data Stores tab right here, that takes us to the data store that's associated with this virtual machine. And if we wanted to browse the files on this data store, there's several ways of doing that. We could click on Browse Files, or we can simply right-click on the data store, and from the drop-down, select Browse Files. So if we click on Linux 1, which is the folder that matches the VM name, here we have a laundry list of files for that virtual machine. So we can click on any column to sort it based on the name or the size or when it was modified. So if we, for example, sort based on size. Even though there's a lot of files here, let me point out a few of the key ones. This file right here, .vmx, is a configuration file for that virtual machine. So if we went to the settings of that virtual machine and we added a piece of hardware, we changed the hardware, that would be reflected in this .vmx configuration file for that VM. The .nvram is the BIOS settings for that virtual machine. Here's a log file, and as time goes on, there will be additional log files. This bad boy right here, the vmdk, is a disk descriptor file. And you know how sometimes when you look at something, it isn't like what it appears? Well, this is one of those cases. Even though it says .vmdk and it looks like it's over 4 gigs in size, and the reason it's not like 16 gigs is because we're using thin provisioning for that VM. But actually, behind the scenes, this is just the descriptor file. There's also a file that includes the name flat in it. For example, linux-1-flat.vmdk, which is not literally shown in this list. But behind the scenes, just be aware that the descriptor file identifies the disk, but the actual contents, the actual 4 gig plus, is in this file with the -flat in it. And based on the browse view here of the data store and the files, VMware has chosen not to directly show us that flat file. The extensions of .vswp, those are swap files, and a vmsd is a snapshot description file. And it's currently 0 because we don't have any snapshots yet. We'll have a separate nugget on snapshots. And this is not a complete list of all the files, but these are some of the key ones that I wanted to introduce you to. So in this nugget, we deployed a virtual machine, and on that virtual machine we have the guest operating system of Linux, which we installed. We also added VMware Tools, which provides, among other things, better device drivers and better integration between a virtual machine, its guest operating system, and the ESXi host that's providing the services. So I would encourage you to practice what we've done together in the hands-on labs, and I'll see you in the next video. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.